So what is SIG-PM? A lot of this question often comes up, and it's like, is it project management? Is it project management? Is it program management? And it's all three. It's meant to be all three. So the PM is overloaded. It's P star M, right? So program, project management. And one of the really interesting things that we run into in trying to do this for open source communities is that a lot of the times the way these structures are built in a company are built around the need to drive some product, to sell something, right? So a lot of the demands that are put on a PM team are done based on generating revenue, right? So within the open source community, we have this really interesting problem where the requirements and the motivations of the people who work in open source are not necessarily the same, right? Sometimes they work for companies, sometimes they're individual contributors, right? And so trying to balance the way we structure something programmatically to build a product and within an open source project is kind of, it's interesting. And the short version is we don't have this solved yet, right? So it's always great to have an opportunity to talk to people day to day about how this can be structured, right? So, we have really interesting conversations. Jason and I have really interesting conversations. And Claire, who's one of our release team leads for 115, is also a program manager at Pivotal. So getting all these minds in the right rooms at the right times is kind of critical for our success right now. So you want to?
Yeah, sure. So the SIG-PM, I'll come back a bit into the history of SIG-PM. So we started as actually, I can show this slide again. So we started as mostly the product management SIG at the beginning. So we've been focused mostly on the way how can you build a product using the open source code base, but how can you build a Kubernetes as a product that will be available for everyone, but with the best practices that came from the commercial world, from the business world. And at the beginning, at the initial phase of SIG-PM, we have bootstrapped the features process, which was like the basic process of how can you, as the project contributor, how can you put your feature to Kubernetes? We define the features themselves as what exactly is a feature and what is not a feature, and how can you see your desired functionality in Kubernetes as a solid product. So, and also, how can you, as the consumer, how can you request and put some ideas to the roadmap? So, it was at the early initial stage. It was called features and like kind of product backlog at that point of time. But after the evolution of Kubernetes as the open source project and with the growing code base, with the growing number of contributors, we figure out that that partners and that ways how this product could be built not necessarily should follow the same procedures and the same processes that are suitable for the commercial companies with the commercial products. So we decided to build SIG-PM and to focus it on like a few different areas. First of all, a few folks from the community proposed to bootstrap the process that is called KEPS, which is the Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal process, and which superseded the features process, because features process was a bit more different and a bit less complicated for at the final end compared to the KEPS process, because the KEPS process is the real process with the huge life cycle. It's not just a single feature which could be like just an alpha, beta, or stable feature, but the KEP process is the huge process that involves all the stages of the feature development, and it covers not only features but the enhancement as well. So there is like the minor difference between the enhancements and the features. So that's basically the same, but enhancements covers more diverse area and
exactly,
and it covers more items within the product roadmap.
So I think that we decided to do a rebrand essentially of like what is a feature and what is an enhancement. So the way that we define it right now is a feature is a unit of work that can be scoped to a single Kubernetes release cycle, right? And an enhancement is essentially a body of work, multiple features. But what's supposed to be captured in that is it's the idea that we can take, we can look back at this and have essentially a steel thread of what happened throughout multiple release cycles, the conversations, the implementations, the motivations, the actual implementation history, the reasons we did and didn't do certain things, right? And capture this in GitHub. So someone who's like, hey, I have this great idea for a feature, or I have this great idea for an enhancement, knows ahead of time. I can read through these things, right? So you know, what we wanted to do here is I think, you know, KEPs have been our primary focus for the last
since 20
four cycles, since 112 kind of. And you know, the goal here is to kind of find, I think that KEPs are in the critical path for everything that's being generated in Kubernetes, anything that you would consider to be code in tree Kubernetes. And you know, and then from there, I think that, you know, the people who are working on KEPs, we're also trying to expand to these, essentially like, what does it mean to be a sub-project within SIG-PM? And you know, some of the ideas that we came up with, and you know, they kind of are spawned from these critical needs of the project. And you know, one of the next top ones is project management, right? How do we do issue triage? How do we do backlog grooming? Is it possible to figure out how to burn this huge backlog down as a community project? And then also, if we can do that, can we start to elicit what a Kubernetes roadmap would look like, right? Can we start to describe the themes around Kubernetes and start to map this out instead of just saying like, hey Claire, what are we doing for this, you know, 115, right? And saying like, what are we gonna do straight up till 120, right? So that's active work. A lot of, it's gonna take a few cycles to get there. But outside of that, we also have the CNCF end user community and external communication. So we're just gonna break down a few of these sub-projects, right? So we kind of talked about KEPs already, and if anyone wants to hear me wax about KEPs for an entire session, that will be the SIG-PM deep dive on Thursday.
Tomorrow.
Thursday?
No, tomorrow.
Just check. So again, the idea is to capture the motivation for these changes, right? Be able to socialize the idea and actually make sure that we keep the history of this, right? So actually committing these ideas to GitHub so people can reference them in the future, right? We also want to make sure that we're creating an artifact that's actually consumable by not just developers, right? Because commonly for you to understand what's going on in people's code, you have to go read their code, right? There are no docs written, you know. So the idea for, you know, part of the idea for a KEP is to be able to, an end user should be able to use it, a developer should be able to use it, the media should be able to read a KEP and generally get the gist of what's going on in that feature, right? And then, you know, having these kind of like these documents, these I guess, you know, if you want to call them PRDs or, you know, what have you, you know, they're inspired by you know, the Python PEPs and the Rust RFCs. So like having these documents then allows you to kind of like map the history of the project and also like kind of get an idea of what the themes are for the project, right? So that's the idea, I think. Yeah.
Just want to add again about the small difference, like the procedural difference between KEPs and features is that the way how we track the features before and how do we are tracking KEPs these days, and how do we put them on GitHub, for example. So previously with the features, we had the features repo, and all the features were tracked as the issues. And if someone, for example, the feature owner, would like to update the feature description or would like to update some information about a feature, like put some updates there, the process for that, like the GitHub interface, allows you to edit your opening message, and that was like basically the way of changing something. With KEPs, we have everything really put on GitHub as the files. So even if someone wants to put any update to these files, you'll be able to track all this information in the GitHub history because of Git.
Right.
So it also will simplify to anybody who'd like to get any history, like to get any information about like what was with this enhancement like. 2 months ago, like 2 release cycles ago.
Yeah.
So it's way easier to track these changes these days.
So so what's really interesting right now is that we're kind of in this split state of using enhancement issues or feature tracking issues, as they were formerly known, and really having the KEP processes at one place that you look for things, right? So to give you a quick rundown of the enhancements lead role, which is part of the release team. So we consider like the enhancements lead and the communications role within the release team kind of like extensions of SIG-PM within SIG release. And the interesting thing that we have right now is previously, so I think we've got two former features lead of the release team for 8-9 cycles.
For 2 years.
Okay, right. And then I did it for 2 cycles as well. But kind of the job is to run through this repo that is 150 or so enhancement tracking issues, right? Collate them on a spreadsheet and reach out to each of the individual owners to kind of understand what the status is, right? And just from hearing that, it's kind of clear that that's not a sustainable process at all, right? And that's kind of like the job. It's one person is ultimately responsible for it, and occasionally they have a team behind them, right? But it's still a massive amount of work, and it's still stuff that we can probably obviate with automation, right? So figuring out how to move from the place of tracking everything manually within GitHub, and then also on the spreadsheet, and then moving to a place where we can automate some of the tooling around KEPs, right? So that we can automatically like generate web pages that will show you what's happening during the release, what SIGs they're related to. So that's like the future goal there. So on the project management end, there are a few things that we're trying to achieve, right? So first and foremost, we want to trivialize the ability to do project-wide issue triage, right? Whether it be issue triage or actually like burning down things, right? So we're at the place where just rough numbers. PM has about 50 issues open. SIG release has about 199 issues open. SIG network has about 150 issues open, right? So these are like really, really large numbers, and and that's just 3 SIGs, right? So considering the work that is required from top-level reviewers. So these are people who are, if you've heard of like the owners files within Kubernetes repos, so essentially those owners files are the way to delegate reviews, right? So once you're in an owner's file, there's some automation that will automatically tag you to do a review on a Kubernetes PR. And if you're high enough in that owner's file to approve, you'll be able to approve it, right, and merge it in. So the problem with these top level owners is they're the people responsible for doing API reviews in Kubernetes, for merging top level in-tree Kubernetes stuff, for doing issue triage, for understanding enough of the history of the project to be effective in all of those roles. And it's kind of clear from hearing that it's easy for those people to be bandwidth constrained, right? So those are people in SIG Arch, those are people like the Tim Hawkins, the Brian Grants, the Jordan Liggett's, where there's only so much time in the day, right? So we need process around burning down and figuring out what's the path of, how does an issue enter Kubernetes and how do we solve it quickly, right? So we're going to solve that with robots coming soon. But our goal is pretty much always to obviate something away with automation, right? So, but for that to be successful, everyone kind of shouts the people process tools, right, Jace? So what we want to do is create a body of project managers within SIG-PM that, and then also align their interest with the need, right? So figure out the SIGs that are dying for help, the SIG nodes, the SIG-auths, SIG networks, and find project managers that are interested in working on that content so that they can actually feel embedded within the SIG once we assign them to a SIG, right? So, the way it currently works right now is I own Azure Release PM, Jace owns some of PM and architecture and API reviews, and so So I think we try to align the people who are currently here, the 4 to 7 people who come to SIG-PM, with the projects that they're already interested in, right? So, once we get to a point where this stuff is actually burned down, again, like I was mentioning, we can start to have these things like SIG planning events and actually do roadmaps for Kubernetes. And this is a common question that we get from the media, right? I think the fun ones are, what's Kubernetes 2.0 going to look like? And the answer is no one knows. Like, that probably will never exist.
You may check in 5 years.
like exactly. Call me in 5 years and we'll see. And the second one is what's the roadmap for Kubernetes? Like, what's happening next, right? And to not be able to have a good answer for that is not great. So we want to move that forward.
And this is the question about the roadmap. Is the question that we are constantly receiving since 2016, probably, when we had our first initial roadmap session at Contributor Summit that happened in Seattle at KubeCon Seattle in the end of 2016, and it was like 1.5 releases, as far as I remember.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So it was a long story of defining the roadmap. It's extremely difficult to do it with the with the open source solution, with the open source product of such a big scale and such a huge code base and so fast pace of development. But it's still possible, and SIG-PM is one of the bodies that is actively working on it.
So I think that nicely segues, and I'll let you take this one. I think that nicely segues into the next one, the next sub-project that we intend to work on. So.
Yeah, so the CNCF and user community is not the body of SIG-PM itself. So CNCF and user community is the body within CNCF. You may remember today's keynote by Cheryl Han, who is a director of ecosystem at CNCF, and she's actually driving the end user community at CNCF. At the same time, the end user community is that group of people and the group of companies who can constantly give us as the Kubernetes community their feedback about how they consume Kubernetes, how they use Kubernetes, what are their desired features, what are the non-desired features. And SIG-PM within the Kubernetes community is exactly the body that is responsible for interacting with the end user community as is. And for example, in Q4 last year, SIG-PM conducted the end user survey, collecting the feedback from the end users on how can you, how do you run Kubernetes? What are the goals for you to run Kubernetes? What do you do? What is the kind of your companies, like the financial company or telecom company or any kind of different company that is consuming Kubernetes? So it was extremely valuable feedback for us as the open source project to understand how people actually use this code base that this community is producing. And also recently, for example, the working group LTS that was recently bootstrapped to Kubernetes community also worked with the CNCF and user community, for example, and getting the information from them about do they need the, for example, the long-term releases of Kubernetes, the releases with the long-term support as, for example, some Linux distribution software from them. So probably someone really needs that for Kubernetes. And also SIG-PM was kind of involved into the process of gathering the feedback. So the goal of, again, just to recap, so the goal of SIG-PM here is to be that bridge between the CNCF and user community, between the people who are consuming these technologies and people who are developing these technologies.
So I think the LTS point is kind of interesting because the cycle that we're currently on, we're on a quarterly release cycle essentially, and things come up, right? We're in a release cycle right now, and most of our release team members are here, and it's the middle of KubeCon, and very soon it'll be KubeCon Shanghai, right? So there are a lot of things to consider in trying to wrangle the right people in the right places at the right time to get these things done. So when you start to consider something like LTS, the burden is greatly increased, right, on a release team, on patch release managers, branch managers, right, because the maintenance becomes that much higher, right? Like, hey, right now we have if we select a patch release manager, that means they maintain patches for as long as that version of Kubernetes exists, right? So if you sign up for that role, you're signing up for a year of work, essentially. So that's something to be aware of, and that's part of the reason that on the SIG release side we're working on creating a patch release management team as opposed to just a person, because that's not great. So some of these things that come up, it also means like if we change the way we do release cycles, how often we do them, if we do them faster or shorter, what have you, that changes the structure of the release team, that changes the structure of the way we need to do PM, right? So it's something that we have to actively watch. So we worked closely with the LTS working group to generate that survey, and I didn't want to present any of the results here today because they also have a session, and that's probably what they're going to be doing in their session. So go to the LTS working group session. I believe it's on Thursday. It's like afternoon Thursday, and check out, if you have opinions about that stuff. It's a great session to be at. And then finally, external communications, right? So this is kind of fuzzy, purposely fuzzy. What we want to be able to do is, there are lots of niceties that you get from being part of the release cycle. So like dealing with release notes and generating that communication. There's a whole like CNCF release train that happens, right? So it's like blog posts, webinars, all these things, podcasts, right? And it's all centered around the release and the things that are going into the release, right? So what we noticed is that there's some dissonance between the things that are going into the release and the things that happen for SIGs within the release cycle, right? Which are not necessarily the same thing, right? So what we're hoping to do eventually is provide a standard way of giving this information to the community, right? Some forum that SIGs can subscribe to or working groups can subscribe to be able to celebrate the work that they've done, and then also like call for volunteers or just generally have that out in the ethos, right? So again, whether it's the blog posts, the podcasts, the surveys, right? But also like generating a means of doing this that has a consistent voice, right? This is the voice of like the Kubernetes project, right? I don't think that we have that. I think we have lots of community leaders that understand the goals of the project, but not necessarily if someone was to come to the project fresh and say like, hey, I have to write a blog post, right? Like this is exactly the template that you need, or if you need to publicize this new feature that you're working on, like you have a forum to do that, right? So we're close, but I think a lot of that stuff is in CNCF hands right now, right? So we want to make sure that that is community owned as opposed to CNCF owned, right?
Yeah, and this initiative about the external communication was initially bootstrapped from the release process. Again, as Steven mentioned, most of the communications that are happening these days around Kubernetes like closely bundled into the release process. Like at the end of the release cycle, when we release the Kubernetes version 1.1 something, CNCF and other community members are publicizing like some blog posts, we record podcasts and
release webinars,
webinars and so on. At the same time, CNCF is the body that is responsible for that, but it shouldn't be the single body, because everybody in the community, every single person, even the individual or any other company, can do that as well. Like publicizing their, like promoting the recent release or promoting the recent achievements of the Kubernetes community, running the podcasts, running the webinars, and so on. So this initiative was bootstrapped from the release process, but these days, the goal of SIG-PM is to make it independent enough from the release train itself.
Cool. So I think that might be it on our slides. So if you're interested in getting involved in SIG-PM, and I recognize some faces from the Zoom calls, join our mailing list, join the Slack channel. So if you're not already on Kubernetes Slack, that's slack.kates.io. The SIG-PM channel is #SIG-PM. And our meetings are bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 6:30 UTC. So we have a few project boards that are up right now and in various states of use. But if you want to hear more about the project boards specifically and our big ticket item, which is KEPs, if you attend the SIG-PM deep dive on Thursday, I will be chatting all about that. So, questions?
The main thing right now is the KEPs, right? And the other projects are not in flight, or they're kind of.
So it's how many saws can you juggle at the same time? So I think this is kind of indicative of the bandwidth constraint things that we're talking about in the project, right? So I think because KEPs are in the critical path for everyone submitting changes to Kubernetes, it's important that we fix that. We make that make sense to everyone. So I think we're at a point where people understand the value of KEPs day to day. There is some friction in the process, and it's partially around deadlines. Some of it's around formatting. Some of it's around can we build more automation around this process? So there are a few different things to tackle. I think that one of the next big things that we need to tackle is start looking at project management very deeply, because it's clear there's a great thread from Tim Hawkins started this one off, and it's called the subject line is "Deadlines are horrible."
Oh yeah, I've done that.
And so that one's a great read, and and it's clear from the discussion there. These are all what I like to call like project elders, reading, telling you like, help, I'm in pain. Right. So I think that that's the next most important thing that we have to do. Yeah. More questions?
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.